The photograph slipped from my trembling fingers and fluttered to the kitchen floor like a dying leaf. My son's voice echoed from the phone, excited, proud, telling me about the children he was helping in some remote village in Vietnam. But all I could see was that little girl's face staring up at me from the glossy paper, her dark eyes wide with the same terror I remembered from 43 years ago when I had pressed the barrel of my M16 against her temple. My name is Robert James Mitchell. I'm 62 years old, and I served 2 tours in Vietnam between 1968 and 1970 with the 1st Infantry Division. Most people who know me today, my neighbors, my coworkers at the hardware store, even my own son, they see a quiet man who keeps his lawn neat and pays his taxes on time. They don't know that some nights I still wake up tasting cordite and hearing the whistle of incoming mortars. They don't know that for 43 years I've carried the weight of what I did in a village called An Loc, 15 miles northeast of Saigon. Danny called me that Tuesday evening in March, his voice crackling through the international connection from somewhere I never thought I'd hear about again. He was 26 then, fresh out of his master's program in international development, full of that idealism that makes young people think they can heal the world's wounds with good intentions and solar panels. "Dad, you should see this place," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "The kids here are incredible. There's this little girl, maybe 8 years old, who's been teaching me Vietnamese. Her grandmother makes the most amazing pho, and the whole village is so grateful for the water purification system we installed." I gripped the phone tighter, my knuckles going white. "What's the name of this village, son?" "An Loc. It's this tiny place, maybe 300 people. Most of them are farmers, growing rice and vegetables. The older folks remember the war, but they're not bitter about it. They just want their grandchildren to have clean water and a chance at school." The words hit me like shrapnel. An Loc. After all these years, after all the miles I'd put between myself and that place, my boy had found his way there. The cosmic joke of it made my chest tight with something between laughter and screaming. "That's wonderful, Danny," I managed to say. "I'm proud of you." And I was proud. Proud and terrified and sick with the irony of it all. When I hung up the phone, I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the shoebox I kept in the back of my closet behind the winter coats that smelled of mothballs. Inside were the things I'd never been able to throw away: my Bronze Star, some letters from my mother, a few photographs that the army photographer had taken during what they called pacification operations. I hadn't looked at these pictures in years, but I knew what I'd find. There it was, a black and white photograph of our platoon after a sweep through An Loc in January 1970. We're standing in front of a cluster of thatched huts, our faces young and hard, our eyes already older than our years. Behind us, villagers watch from doorways, women clutching children, old men with faces like weathered stone, kids peering around their mother's legs. I found her immediately. Third hut from the right, standing next to an old woman who might have been her grandmother. She couldn't have been more than 5 then, this tiny girl with eyes that seemed too large for her face. The same eyes that had looked up at me when I pressed my rifle to her head and screamed at her in broken Vietnamese, demanding to know where the Viet Cong were hiding their weapons. The memory came back like a fever dream. It was January 15, 1970. We'd been in country for 8 months, and every day had been a lesson in how quickly you could lose pieces of yourself. The night before, Charlie had hit our firebase with mortars, and we'd lost 3 guys from Alpha Company. Good kids from Ohio and Texas who'd never hurt anyone before they got drafted into that green hell. We'd been ordered to sweep An Loc because intelligence said the villagers were hiding VC supplies. Intelligence was often wrong, but orders were orders, and by then we were all wired tight with fear and anger and the kind of fatigue that makes everything look like a threat. I remember the heat that day, how it pressed down on us like a wet blanket. I remember the way the villagers watched us as we went house to house, their faces careful and neutral. Most of the men were gone, working in the fields or hiding in the jungle, depending on which side you believed. The women and children and old folks who remained moved slowly, deliberately, the way you move when you know that sudden motions can get you killed. We found nothing in the first 6 huts, no weapons, no ammunition, no evidence that anyone in An Loc had ever heard of the Viet Cong. But Sergeant Peterson was convinced we were being played, that the villagers were protecting the enemy. He kept pushing us to search harder, look deeper, make them tell us what they knew. That's when I saw her. She was sitting in the dirt outside her family's hut, playing with a doll made from corn husks and bits of cloth. When she saw me approaching, she looked up with those enormous dark eyes, and something in her expression, maybe it was trust, maybe it was curiosity, made me stop in my tracks. "Where are they?" I found myself asking in Vietnamese, though I knew my pronunciation was terrible. "Where are the weapons?" She tilted her head, not understanding or pretending not to understand. Behind her, an old woman emerged from the hut, her grandmother, I assumed, and began speaking rapidly in Vietnamese, gesturing with her hands. "She says the child knows nothing," our interpreter, a young South Vietnamese soldier named Duc, translated. "She says there are no weapons here." But Peterson wasn't satisfied. He grabbed my shoulder and hissed in my ear, "Make them tell us, Mitchell. Do whatever it takes." That's when I did it. That's when I became someone I didn't recognize, someone I've spent 43 years trying to forget. I pointed my rifle at the little girl and pressed the barrel against her temple. She didn't cry or struggle. She just looked at me with those huge eyes, and I saw in them a kind of acceptance that no 5-year-old should ever have to carry. "Tell me where they are," I shouted, my voice cracking with rage and fear and something darker. "Tell me or I'll—" But I couldn't finish the threat. The words died in my throat as I looked into her face and saw not an enemy but a child. Just a child who was probably wondering why this strange soldier with the dirty face and wild eyes was pointing a gun at her head. The grandmother stepped forward then, her hands raised, speaking in a voice that was calm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. She reached out slowly, carefully, and placed her weathered hand on my arm. "Please," she said in English, the word heavily accented but clear. "Please, she is only baby." I stared at that old woman's hand on my arm, at the deep lines etched by decades of hard work and loss, at the way her fingers trembled with fear but still managed to convey something like compassion. For a moment that felt like hours we stood there, the angry American soldier, the terrified child, and the grandmother who was trying to build a bridge across a chasm of language and hate and war. Then Peterson yelled something about moving out, and the spell was broken. I lowered my rifle and stepped back, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the weapon. The little girl remained sitting in the dirt, still looking at me with those eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. We found no weapons in An Loc that day. We filed a report saying the village was clean, and I never spoke about what happened with the little girl. Not to Peterson, not to the other guys in my squad, not to anyone. Some things are too small and too enormous to put into words, but I never forgot her face. Now, 43 years later, my son was showing me photographs of the children he was helping in An Loc, and there she was again. Not the 5-year-old with the corn husk doll, but a woman in her 40s, standing with a group of village children outside a newly built school. The bone structure was the same, the shape of her eyes unchanged by time. It was her. Danny called again 3 days later with more stories about his work. He talked about the grandmother who made the best pho in the village, about the children who were learning English, about the way the whole community had come together to help with the water project. "There's this woman, Dad," he said, his voice warm with affection. "Her name is Ling. She's been our translator and guide since we got here. She lost her parents when she was young, raised by her grandmother. She's got this incredible strength, you know, like she's seen the worst the world has to offer, but still believes in goodness." Ling. Her name was Ling. "She has children of her own now," Danny continued. 2 boys and a girl. The oldest is about 8, same age Ling was when her grandmother told her stories about the American War. But there's no bitterness in her, Dad. She treats us like family. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on my chest. "Tell me about her grandmother," I said. "She's amazing, must be in her 80s now, but she still works every day, takes care of the whole family. Ling says she's the strongest person in the village, that she taught all the children how to forgive. How to forgive." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about that moment in 1970 when an old woman had placed her hand on my arm and called a terrified child baby. I thought about the weight of secrets, about the stories we tell our children and the ones we keep locked away. I thought about Danny, my good-hearted son who was bringing clean water to a village where his father had once threatened to murder a little girl. The next morning, I called Danny before I could lose my nerve. "Son, I need to tell you something about Unlock," I said, and then I told him everything. About the war, about the fear, about the moment when I became someone I didn't recognize, about the little girl with the enormous eyes and the grandmother who had shown me more grace than I deserved. Danny was quiet for a long time after I finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Dad," he said softly. "Lynn's grandmother, her name is Ba Nu. She's the one who makes the pho." Ba Nu. I repeated the name silently, tasting its syllables. "I want to come there," I said. "I want to see her again." "Are you sure, Dad?" "It might be." "I'm sure. I need to apologize. I need to try to make this right." 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Ho Chi Minh City, my hands shaking, as we descended through the clouds over the country I'd left as a broken young man 43 years earlier. Danny met me at the airport, and we drove north in a rented Jeep through countryside that looked both familiar and foreign. The rice paddies were the same brilliant green I remembered, but now they were crisscrossed with power lines and dotted with cell phone towers. The war was history here, just another chapter in a story that continued to unfold. And Locke looked different too. The thatched huts had been replaced by concrete houses with corrugated metal roofs. There was a school now, and a small clinic, and solar panels glinting on several rooftops. Children played in the dusty streets, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. But as we walked through the village, I began to recognize the bones of the place beneath its new skin. There was the bend in the road where our convoy had always slowed down. There was the large tamarind tree, where we'd set up our radio. There was the spot where I'd knelt in the dirt and pressed my rifle against a child's head. Danny led me to a small house near the center of the village, its walls painted pale blue with bright yellow trim. An older woman was sitting on the front step, peeling vegetables into a metal bowl. When she looked up and saw me, her hands went still. It was her, Ba Nu, older, smaller, her hair completely white now, but her eyes still held that same depth I remembered. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact when recognition dawned. Her face didn't change expression, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that told me she knew exactly who I was. "Ba Nu," I said, the words coming out rougher than I'd intended. "My name is Robert Mitchell. I was here during the war." She nodded slowly, still watching my face. Then she spoke in Vietnamese to Danny, who translated for me. "She says she remembers you. She says you were very young then, very afraid, very afraid." The simple truth of it made my throat close up. "I came to apologize," I said, looking directly at her. "What I did to your granddaughter, what I did to Lynn, it was wrong. I've carried the shame of it for 43 years, and I know that saying sorry doesn't change anything. But I needed you to know that I never forgot. I never stopped regretting what I did." Danny translated, and Ba Nu listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, her weathered hands still folded around the bowl of vegetables. Then she stood up, moving slowly but with dignity, and walked toward me. She stopped when she was close enough to touch, and we looked at each other across the decades. I saw in her face the same woman who had placed her hand on my arm and called her granddaughter baby. But now there were new lines around her eyes, and her hair was white as rice paper, and her hands were even more gnarled with age and work. Without speaking, she reached up and placed her palm against my cheek. Her skin was rough and warm, and I felt something break open inside my chest. 43 years of grief and guilt and self-hatred spilling out like water from a cracked dam. "She says," Danny's voice came from somewhere far away, "that she forgave you a long time ago. She says that carrying anger is like carrying stones. it only makes the journey harder. I started crying then, standing in the dusty street of Loch with an old Vietnamese woman's hand on my face, weeping like I hadn't wept since I was a child. All the tears I'd held back for 4 decades came pouring out, and Ba Nu just stood there, her hand steady against my cheek, letting me fall apart. When I finally pulled myself together, she was smiling. Not a big smile, just a small curve of her lips that somehow contained more forgiveness than I'd ever imagined possible. That evening the whole village seemed to materialize around Ba Nu's house. People brought food and children and stories, and we sat in a circle as the sun went down, sharing a meal that tasted like redemption. Lynn was there too, quiet and gracious, and when she looked at me, I saw not hatred or fear, but a kind of curious compassion. She wants to know about your son, Danny translated after Lynn spoke to him in Vietnamese. She says she can see where he gets his good heart. We talked late into the night with Danny translating between English and Vietnamese, building bridges across language and time. Ba Nu told me about the years after the war, about rebuilding the village, about raising Lynn, and watching her grow into a woman who could transform pain into purpose. Lynn told me about her children, about her dreams for their future, about the way the solar panels Danny's organization had installed were already changing life in the village, and I told them about my own journey, about coming home from war and not knowing how to live with what I'd done, about raising a son while carrying secrets that weighed more than my own body, about watching Danny grow into the kind of man who builds rather than destroys. We all carry scars from that time, Ba Nu said through Danny's translation. But scars are proof that we survived, and sometimes if we're lucky they remind us to be more gentle with each other. I stayed in Loch for a week, working alongside Danny and the other volunteers on their projects. I helped install water filters, and taught English to children who giggled at my terrible pronunciation. I learned to make pho from Ba Nu, standing in her kitchen while she showed me how to balance the spices and simmer the broth, until it sang with flavor. Every morning I walked to the spot where I'd knelt in the dirt 43 years earlier, and every morning it felt a little less like a place of shame and a little more like a place of possibility. The children played around me as I sat there, their laughter slowly replacing the sound of helicopters that had echoed in my memory for so long. On my last day, Ba Nu gave me a gift, a small wooden Buddha that she said had belonged to her husband, who died fighting against the French long before the Americans arrived. For peace, she said in English the words careful but clear, peace inside. I carry that Buddha in my pocket now, running my fingers over its smooth surface when the memories get too heavy. It reminds me that forgiveness isn't something you earn or deserve, it's something you receive, like grace, like morning light, like the sound of children laughing in a place where there was once only fear. Danny and I work together now, raising money for his organization from our small town in Ohio. We show photographs of Loch at church meetings and Rotary Club lunches, telling people about the children who need school supplies and the families who could use solar panels. I've become the kind of grandfather who has stories to tell, though not all of them are easy to hear. Sometimes I wake up at night and think about the weight of memory, about how the past can reach across decades to touch the present in ways we never expect. I think about Ba Nu's hand on my cheek, about the way forgiveness can happen without words, about how my son found his way to the exact place where his father's heart was broken, and somehow helped put it back together. I think about the little girl I threatened to kill, who grew up to be a woman who could welcome her father's enemy into her home and treat him like family. I think about the grandmother who taught her that carrying anger is like carrying stones, and about the way some lessons can only be learned through living. Most of all, I think about Danny, my good-hearted son who builds wells and teaches children and somehow, without ever knowing it, spent his life undoing the damage his father had done. There's a kind of poetry in that, a symmetry that feels almost too perfect to be real. But it is real as the scar on my left hand from a piece of shrapnel that found me in 1969, as real as the white hair that now covers Ba Nu's head, as real as the solar panels that gleam on the rooftops of Loch, powering lights that push back the darkness. Sometimes redemption comes not as a single moment of revelation, but as a slow accumulation of small acts of kindness, small choices to build rather than destroy, small decisions to carry love instead of stones. Sometimes it comes in the form of a son who chooses to heal the same wounds his father helped create, or a grandmother who understands that forgiveness is not about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let it poison the future. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, it comes in the form of a hand on our cheek, and the simple recognition that we are all more than the worst things we've ever done, that there is always another chance to choose differently, to be better, to turn toward the light instead of away from it. I am 62 years old, and I am still learning how to live with the weight of memory, but now at least, I know that the weight doesn't have to crush me. It can also teach me to be more careful with my steps, more gentle with my words, more grateful for the grace that finds us in the most unexpected places. In Loch, a village I once helped tear apart, where children now play in the shade of solar panels and drink clean water from wells built with love, where forgiveness grew from the ground like rice, nourishing everyone it touched, where a soldier learned, 43 years too late, that there are some wounds that can only be healed by returning to the place where they were made.